My name is Timothy Clark, and I'm a reporter on economics for the National Journal magazine in Washington, D.C. I'm here to moderate a discussion on the subject of competitiveness sponsored by the National Economists Club Educational Foundation, also of Washington, D.C. I thought I'd start out by saying a few words about the subject of competitiveness. It is, of course, the hot topic here in the nation's capital today. The administration and Congress have aggressively taken up the theme that the United States is losing its ability to compete in world trade. Inadequate education and training, inadequate incentives for investment in equipment, and short-sighted business practices are among reasons offered for the problem. We have with us here today two highly qualified panelists who will discuss the economic aspects of this issue. On my right, Robert Z. Lawrence is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He has conducted research and written extensively in the trade field, especially as it affects the manufacturing sector. John Makin, on my left, is a resident scholar and director of fiscal policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, who is specializing recently on international economic matters. He is the author of a recent paper delivered before the National Economists Club called Competitiveness, a red herring or a real problem. And I thought we'd try to get this off to a lively start by asking each of our panelists to answer that question in 15 seconds. Bob Lawrence, is it a real problem or a red herring?
Well, I'll have to take your bait, and I'll say that there are some problems. They may not be the ones that a lot of people are pointing to. Lots of people have different fish to fry, but I do think that there is a problem of competitiveness.
And you, John?
I think that competitiveness will be the apple pie of the 1988 presidential campaign. Nobody's going to be for uncompetitiveness. But there are some problems, but I'm afraid that it's going to be, in effect, a red herring, because everything that's wrong is going to be said to be part of the competitiveness problem, and it's going to be, therefore, a lever for various special interests to put forward some legislation that's in their favor. So it's something you want to treat very carefully. I do agree with Bob that there are some serious problems. And the way let me just put out a definition here. I think that the trade balance deficit and competitiveness are not the same problem. The trade balance deficit is kind of a macro problem that can be dealt with through movements in the economy that would normally occur anyway. Competitiveness is going to take some structural micro work.
Thank you, John. Let's start off by talking about the trade deficit and its causes a bit. I'd like to ask our panelists to address the question of the extent to which the strengthening of the dollar from 1980 to early 1985 was responsible for the deterioration of the U.S. trade balance. And also to tell us whether the sharp decline in the dollar over the past 2 years should not be producing a more pronounced improvement in our trade position than has been evidenced so far. Bob?
Well, I would say that the strength of the dollar was the predominant reason why we had a large trade deficit emerge. I think that our firms, particularly in the manufacturing sector, have simply been priced out of world markets. You can measure productivity improvements by 1 or 2%, but when the dollar goes up on a wide basis by 50 or 60% as it did through March of 1985, it's extremely difficult for almost all firms to compete. And so I think maybe 70%, or to name a number, of that, the emergence of that trade deficit can be attributed to the fact that our goods became more expensive than those of our competitors. There were many other factors at work, and maybe we can get into some of those later, but so I think the dollar was predominantly the reason. Now, if you ask the question why the dollar started falling in March of 1985, and since that time we haven't seen a lot of improvement, I would argue that you should have expected the improvement to be slow. Firstly, the dollar was so strong that many foreign firms selling in the American market were enjoying significant profit margins. And so the first effect of the dollar weakening was to squeeze their profit margins, but not to force them to raise their prices. So the consumer didn't see the strengthening of the dollar, the weakening of the dollar, and the consumer therefore didn't change their buying habits. And that's true basically for the first year, more or less, of the dollar's decline. But around about March of 1986, you did start to see import prices rising for manufactured products. And if you look as of September, you see that across a wide range of products, imports are up by 20 to 25% in price. That's true of cameras, that's true of video recorders, it's true in the capital goods area. So you are seeing price rises, and you will gradually see buyers start to respond to those prices. So I would argue on the import side, yes, we're going to see improvements. They're slow in coming. We should expect that. Now, on the export side, there was another interesting reason why the turnaround has been so slow. Basically, the dollar got so strong that for its first 10 or 15% as it began to rise, what we found was that American producers of products that are very sensitive to price, textile manufacturers, chemicals manufacturers, they started to lose their markets very, very rapidly. Now, when the dollar went from 20% too high to 50% too high, it didn't make much difference to those kinds of products because they were simply too expensive anyway. Now, when the dollar started to fall, for the first 20 or 30% of that decline, we still had a lot of products that simply weren't contenders. It's only once we've gotten down now to the range where a much broader array of our products are potentially exportable that we're going to see big gains. So my view is, again, on the export side, the first declines in the dollar from March 85 were not of great help because we weren't selling very many goods that are price sensitive. Now I think every additional 5 or 10% is substantial, and I expect to see improvements in the export performance looking over the next year or so.
Okay, let's move on to this question. I'd like our panelists here to tell us to what extent the large U.S. trade deficit is a relatively short-run business cycle development, reflecting first a fairly rapid increase in U.S. domestic demand, and second, slow recovery in foreign countries and a consequent weak foreign demand for U.S. exports. Bob?
Well, I think to some extent there is a business cycle effect. I would add our economy has been growing somewhat faster than the rest of the world. You shouldn't exaggerate that. It all depends where you measure it from. If you take it from 1980, you get less of a difference in our growth rates compared to the rest of the world than if you do from 1982, for instance. So but there is some effect there. Slow growth is important. I would add to that that a lot of our customers have debt problems. And that's the second sort of effect. I don't know if you'd purely call it a business cycle effect, but the fact is we have very important shares of our exports going to OPEC countries, and with the price of oil low, they've stopped buying as much as they used to. And developing countries in general, with their debt problems, have been forced to cut back their purchases of the kind of investment goods in particular that we sell. So the weak global economy is a second factor that one would add to the effect of the dollar and in my view, linked to the budget deficits, to explain even more of the trade deficit.
John, as you know, the administration, the U.S. administration, has been pressing Germany and Japan to step up their growth rates, saying that this would help us with the trade deficit. I wonder whether you think that, in fact, such an acceleration in the economies of those two countries would do much over what period of time?
I think it would help. I know that both Germany and Japan and their economic officials have separately and together produced estimates that suggest that if they increase their growth rates, it wouldn't help the U.S. trade balance tremendously in the short run. But I think a general expansionary policy in other major industrial countries would reduce the risk of a slowdown in the world economy, which I think is increasing the risk of some unilateral protectionist moves by the United States. So that I think it's a mistake to say Germany and Japan should expand because it's going to reduce the American trade deficit. I think it's correct to say that Germany and Japan ought to expand a bit in order to reduce the likelihood of a world recession, which might be accompanied by an unattractive and dangerous trade war.
Let's talk for a moment about labor's element in the competitiveness question. It is often said that the U.S. products are not competitive because our wage rates are too high. The steel industry is an industry that is frequently cited as an example. Wage rates, or rather compensation rates, are over $20 an hour in that industry. And the automobile industry is another such example. I'd like to ask Bob Lawrence to what extent he thinks our trade problems are attributable to unfavorable trends in hourly wage rates and productivity as contrasted to the trends in other nations.
Well, I think it's very important to add to the question of wages the level of productivity. Basically, there is no reason why a country cannot compete in world markets with high wages, provided it is sufficiently productive to offset those higher costs, those higher wage costs, and so the product should cost the same. We do not, by the way, have the predominant sources of our trade deficit occurring with cheap wage countries. Indeed, it's quite remarkable that the share of our imports, for instance, from developing countries, the low-wage countries, isn't much different today than it was in 1980. And basically, they only account for about a quarter of all of our manufactured imports. So 3/4 of our imports come from countries who have wage levels that are more or less the same as ours. So I don't see the wage factor as the key element. It is true that certain of our industries had wage rates which ran far ahead of the average, and in particular in the steel case, it was not really reflective of their underlying productivity, but more reflective of the strength of their unions. And so it became more and more difficult to manufacture steel in this country, particularly of the kind that is made in large mills. That's something developing countries tend to do much better than we do. So I do think that there are some industries where wages have added to their competitive difficulties, but that broadly speaking, a country should, like ours, should be able to pay high wages and still compete in world markets by exploiting our better skills, education, and technology in order to offset those higher wages.
But John, let me ask you to comment on the rise of technology in very low wage countries. While what Bob has said is doubtless true, is it not also true that if the Koreas and Singapores and other newly industrialized countries with very low wage rates also catch up to us or even surpass us in the level of technological achievement and investment, that this could change the situation?
Yes, it can. But I think you want to ask yourself not about wages, but about wage costs, which is real wages divided by productivity. And yes, as the NICs, the newly industrialized countries, add capital, their labor becomes more productive. They can pay a higher wage and still gain a comparative advantage relative to the United States. But I think it's important to remember that when you look at the productivity and real wage numbers for the United States since 1982, when this problem began to get serious, you see some improvement. That is, the wage cost, the real wages adjusted for productivity in the U.S., have come down a bit, particularly in manufacturing, which is where the bulk of our trade deficit arises. Unfortunately for us, the same has happened in the countries that are our major competitors, particularly Germany and Japan, have also experienced a drop in their wage costs, largely by virtue of very good productivity performance. And in this case, when you're talking about competitiveness, you're always talking about what we do relative to what they do. That's really what it's all about. So while we can take heart that we haven't fallen further behind, we still have to do better.
Could I just add to to emphasize something that John said, and that is your question presumed that when all this technology goes to Korea and when they invest more and more, their wages are going to remain low. Right. But what we've seen, and indeed we saw this so clearly with Europe and Japan, don't forget that those were countries that we thought were very low-wage countries in the 1960s. But as they improved their technology, as they invested more, so their wage levels rose to reflect that. So my answer to your question would be that when Korea and Taiwan and so on have our levels of productivity growth, levels of productivity, they'll tend to have our wage rates.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Bob, let me ask you whether we're really not living in a very different world today than the world of 20 to 25 years ago, when the United States was really dominant in world trade, and whether it was not inevitable that we would lose ground in consumer durables and automobiles and other such products, and how we have managed to adjust to that reality, if you think it is.
I think there was a large element of inevitability in the convergence, if you will, of other countries to American productivity levels and income levels. Basically, God did not put Americans on this earth to be indefinitely twice as rich as other developed countries. And it's much harder to push out the technological frontier, which is where we were, than it is to copy. And so that over time, one of the great successes of the world economy was that it spread technology around and allowed others to adopt the technologies which we had, and therefore to come much closer to our productivity levels. I think we remain number one among the major developed countries, but our lead is now on the order of 10% rather than 50% that it was, say, in 1950. But I think it's important to emphasize that the mere fact that others are richer doesn't make us absolutely poorer. And in fact, I think there are numerous benefits that we derive from the fact that now they are more technologically advanced. After all, in several industries, we can now copy their superior technologies. What we see in our auto industry, for instance, is that we're learning an awful lot from the Japanese. They made some discoveries, they discovered some good management techniques. We're now adopting them. So that by being able to have technologically advanced countries in the rest of the world, we may well do better rather than be poorer. And secondly, there are now much richer markets for us. If we can open those markets, and that's a critical factor, there's a lot of buying power there today which wasn't there before. And so I don't think we should think of our wealth as depending on others being poor. In fact, I think it's the very opposite. I think we are going to be better off the wealthier they are.
I wonder, John, whether you agree with what Bob said, and whether this, if you do agree, whether this is something that is going to happen sometime in the future. I think let me ask you to answer that question in this context. Studies show that family income adjusted for inflation had declined beginning in 1973 erratically, and while it's made some gains, it's still not at its level of 1979, so that the standards of living in the United States as it has become increasingly engaged in the world economy arguably have not increased very much, and some say have declined.
Well, I think when you look at the average rates of growth of the U.S. economy, the notion that we developed in the 60s that the future was always going to be remarkably better than the past isn't sustainable. But I think at the same time you have to remember that while we were improving those living standards, we were accumulating tremendous wealth. The income is not the only measure of economic well-being. It's a stock of accumulated wealth, which we don't lose as long as we invest enough to maintain it, and we are doing that, although we're doing relatively little to increase that stock of wealth. Let's face it, there certainly are poor in America, but as a nation and on average, this is an incredibly wealthy country, and we're beginning to behave like a wealthy country. The idea of saving, which remember, saving is to provide for an increase in future living standards. Well, that's not as exciting when you are one of the wealthiest industrial countries in the world as it is when you are a country, let's say, that after a war has experienced a tremendous cut in living standards, as Europe and Japan did after World War II, especially Japan. So it's a matter, there is some attitude adjustment here. The other point that I would add to, are we adapting, and add to what Bob was saying, in a way we are adapting, but the notions of competitiveness and how we operate in the world economy are being uncoupled from nations. To say that America competes doesn't really cover the case of the American company that takes its capital, takes a few managers and goes somewhere else. Again, the example of Japan is a good one because that's a country where we seem to feel we're just not measuring up. But where a company goes to Japan, learns how to do business in Japan, it's an American company, but it's employing Japanese. A good example that I often use because it's one that we're familiar with, Eastman Kodak Company has 20% of the photographic equipment market in Japan. They have it because they're there producing in Japan and distributing in Japan Japanese style, which is very different from the United States. And so that when Kodak Japan sells 20% of the market in Japan, it's not counted as an American export. But I think it should be counted as a resilient, competitive response by an American company. There are a lot of changes in kind of mindset in the way we think about things that are going to be necessary because the world economy is just not economically divided up along national lines. It's not us and them as much as it is our capital, their labor.
Let us address the frequently heard charge that other countries don't play fair. The argument is made frequently on Capitol Hill that we don't have a level playing field in international trade. And I wonder, Bob, how valid you think that is from an economic point of view.
Well, I don't think there is a level playing field in international trade, nor do I think there ever will be one. In fact, we understand that one reason why competition between firms internationally is different from domestically is the fact that the firms are located in different countries. And these countries differ in terms of the environment that they provide for firms. So that you just can't get the same kind of equalization that you get within a single economy than you will when you are competing internationally. So I think that there's always going to be some slope to that playing field of international competition. I mean, try to think, what does it mean to have fair trade between the United States and the Soviet Union? We just have totally different economic systems. But that doesn't mean to say that we ought not to trade with those countries. And in fact, it seems to me that when we talk about our competition with other developed countries, although we may not be able to get the slope of the playing field level, we can get some agreement on the rules of the game. And so that's got to be our emphasis. It's got to be in a cooperative way to try to get some notion that we have certain standards. And we've worked on those. They're not perfect. There's a lot of room for improvement. But I would just add that this question of unfairness, which is important and which needs international negotiation, is not very strongly linked, again, to this emergence of our large trade deficit. These are mixed up in the minds of many, but they're not really related. And the way you can see that is to observe that in 1981, or 1980 as you mentioned, we had a rather strong trading position. We had a very substantial surplus in manufactured products. And the world system hasn't changed all that much since 1981. So there was nothing intrinsic in the system in 1981. There was nothing about the slope of the playing field in 1981 that said the United States has to run a large deficit. We were quite able to run surpluses no matter what the slope of the playing field was in 1981. And I would submit that what's changed since then is the value of the dollar. And if anything, our country has become more protectionist since then. And we've seen a lowering of barriers in Japan in particular. So that you can't link, you ought not to link, this question of unfairness to the trade deficit. We need to take measures to deal with unfairness, but it's not directly linked to our underlying trade deficit.
John, let me ask you to expand just for a moment on the point that Bob made as to how the U.S. has become more protectionist. In particular, it seems to me that our huge subsidies to the agricultural sector, $25 or $30 billion a year, I think it is, or maybe it's even more, are evidence that our hands are not clean in terms of helping sectors of the economy that have been traditionally strong exporters.
Well, no, our hands aren't clean, and it's not constructive, as Bob suggests, to get into a real argument about whose hands are dirtier. But yes, we have probably accelerated the tendency toward protectionism, partly because the administration has felt that they were on the defensive and had to be more aggressive, and so you have large subsidies to agriculture, you have protection for the machine tool industry on national defense grounds, other incidents that are indications of protection. I think really these are a reflection of something that is going on globally, and that is the world economy in 1986 and 1987 is slowing down. When the pie gets smaller, people quarrel a little more intensely, or a lot more intensely, for their piece. And that's what we're seeing now. And so the tension will rise unless we get the world back on an expansionary path, and the name-calling and the whose hands are clean and dirty rhetoric will intensify as it has in the past.
I'm going to stop there for a moment and ask our audience whether they have questions for our panelists. Yes, sir.
I'd like to focus a little more on what John Makin had in mind when he spoke of the public attitude towards saving and investment. I wonder whether this doesn't deserve more attention as a major factor in the trade deficit. You know, we've, as a public, have become accustomed to receiving a large quantity of government services which we're not willing to pay for. Witness what happened to Walter Mondale when he suggested raising taxes to pay for these things. Likewise, we have become accustomed to a higher living standards than our incomes justify. Witness the growth in credit card use and traditional installment sales. Now, when the government deficit pumps up incomes, as it has through its macroeconomic effect, people tend to spend more on imports than they do on domestic goods. This has always been true, that in periods of expanding incomes, imports do rise faster than domestic production. Now, what is the if this has any significance? What can be done to control or limit it? Is it a matter of public education, that we're asking for too much, that we're living beyond our means? How do you handle that?
Well, let me be a little bit philosophical here about the proximate. There's a difference between the proximate solution, which is to invest, save more and invest more, work harder, and so on, and the real solution. I think that you have to look at the United States and realize that within the living memory of most Americans, and I think if you looked at the numbers, the historical numbers, you'd find that each generation has always turned out to have a higher living standard than the previous one, although, as Tim has pointed out, that's being moderated. And secondly, that we've historically had a relatively low saving rate, so that our advanced provision for an improvement in living standards has been limited, but something has always turned up, either productivity or breakthrough and so on. So we're kind of a jocular nation when it comes to looking at the future. Something's going to turn up, why worry? If you compare that experience again with take Japan, and to give you some orientation, if American living standards in 1980 were 100, and you look at where Japan was before World War II, it was a 12. After the war, it was a 6. That's relative to 100 in the United States. nothing promotes saving among the current generation like the prospect that your children will starve if you don't. And we don't really have to confront that reality at this point in the United States. And in fact, I think in our own minds and in the minds of our leaders, something will always turn up. And so the notion that we're going to suddenly get worried about competitiveness and start saving more is probably a remote one. I think it's going to take more tangible evidence that maybe something won't turn up, or who knows, maybe something will. But it's the risky path to follow.
You don't consider that we're living beyond our means at the present time, as reflected by the trade deficit?
Sure, but we can afford it. We're rich.
I would just disagree with that. We can afford it for a short period of time, but we can't go on like this. Basically, if you look at our national spending on consumption, investment, and government, since 1980, it's increased in real terms about 22%. So we feel really great. Basically, we're living in the 60s. 4% annual growth rate is tremendous. But if you look at what we've actually produced in this country, you'll find that that's only growing at 2.7%. It's only up 16%. So how do we do that? Obviously, by borrowing to make up the difference. 6% of our growth is based on borrowing. Now, as John said, we're rich. We're running down our foreign assets. But you can't go on like that. You can't do that forever. You know you're going to run out of money eventually. Common sense tells you so. So you have to tighten your belt. And the question is, when are you going to do it and what's going to make you do it? You can go on the way you're doing it. You can keep spending more than your income. You can keep running down your assets. You can keep accumulating debt. We know that. If you're rich, people will let you get away with it for a while. But at some time in the future, you're going to pay. And the point is, the longer you go on, the more debt you've accumulated, the more difficult it's going to be at that time. So I would say that that is our major problem. I think you're dead right. It is a country living beyond its means. If we were simply borrowing this money to spend on investment, if investment had really gone up as a share of our gross national product, we could relax because we were doing something with the money that would help us pay it back in the future. But what we've done is to keep our investment more or less at the same level of our gross national product as it was when Jimmy Carter was in office. So we haven't really increased our investment all that much. We've used it to finance the other two, consumption and government, and we haven't basically saved to pay for that. We're going to have to pay in the future. Now, we could indeed try to rely if we don't want to cut back our spending, we have another alternative, and that is to produce more. And that's what competitiveness is really about. It's saying, can we get more productive to raise what we produce to the level of our current spending, rather than reduce our spending to the level of what we produce? Those are clearly two ways to adjust. So it would be nice, and it will be nice, if we can increase our productivity so that we produce more, and then we'll have to reduce our spending by less. That's what we would prefer to do. But if we don't do that, we'll have to do the second alternative, which is to cut our spending to tighten our belts. Now, our political system, our politicians, don't like to tell us this bad news. And indeed, the message of Walter Mondale was, you don't get elected if you tell the American people the bad news. But I believe that we are living beyond our means. We have to tighten our belt. Competitiveness is one way to ease the pain of doing that, but the alternative, cutting spending, is probably what we're going to have to rely on to a greater degree.
I have a question that ties in with what Bob Lawrence was just saying. It also ties in with the first program in our series, which was on growth and productivity. My question is, in sort of a 1, 2, 3 way, what would you two experts see as the things we ought to give priority to in order to increase productivity, in order to increase growth, in order to have more resources, in order to do what we want to do?
Let me say firstly that the dominant reason why our living standards has not increased over the last decade as it did previously is not related to our international performance. It's true our economy has become more internationalized, and in the minds of many, the competitive problems of the country are responsible for the failure of living standards to grow. But let's remember that 90% of what we consume and buy today are products made in America. And it's really the productivity in what we call non-tradable or in services area that has been so weak over the last decade. We've basically had zero productivity growth, literally zero improvement in productivity in those non-traded areas, in the services area. And so that's really where the focus of our national attention should be. Now, to be quite honest, we don't understand very well the reasons why we've had such low productivity growth in services. We've invested a lot in computers, but they don't seem to be paying off in improving productivity. So I think that it's really the non-traded parts of the economy that deserve the bulk of our attention. I think number two, we have to obviously concentrate on the good old-fashioned sources of growth, and that's technology and education. Those are the major areas where living standards, when improvements in living standards stem from, and that's where the bulk of our attention has to be placed. And then I would just add that making our economy more flexible, more able to shift resources from areas where they're less needed to where they're more required is also important. And that has to do with aiding those who are dislocated, with facilitating the retraining of people who have to move from stagnant areas to areas of growth.
John, would you like to add something?
Well, yeah, I think that Bob's recipe is one that all economists would agree on, although I'll give you mine. But let me just say that how many people watching this program or sitting in this room want to work harder and spend less? I haven't seen many lately, frankly. The best way to accomplish all the things that Bob described would be to impose a consumption-based tax so that we stop taxing saving twice and we tax consumption. A broadly based, low-rate consumption tax would be the best way that I could think of to deal with the very issue that Bob addressed, that is, we're spending more than we're earning. I don't see any support for a consumption tax. Every politician stays away from it. You can't sell it. Nobody wants to do it. Another way to improve competitiveness and reduce the budget deficit would be to reduce the largest and fastest growing portion of government spending. That would include more realistic indexing of Social Security outlays. Any volunteers? So, you know, I mean, I agree with all the sentiments that Bob has expressed, and in fact, I've expressed them myself, but you know, economists end up being in the position of the Cassandras who say, you know, if this goes on, it's going to lead to trouble, and it will. I mean, by definition, if you spend more than you earn and you accumulate debt, gradually the terms on which you can borrow get worse, and we're beginning even to see that now as interest rates have stopped falling and started pushing up again. But one thing an economist can't tell you, or at least I can't, is, you know, when it really sinks in, when the move back toward an equilibrium where we do adjust spending in line with underlying income. Right now we're spending, you don't have to align expenditure and income on a day-to-day basis. We are now spending like we think that the relatively low growth rate of the 1980s is a temporary aberration. And so we say, well, we got to raise productivity. Well, of course we have to raise productivity, but again, the way we raise productivity, productivity growth, when we talk about how fast the economy has grown, we say, well, a lot of it's due to productivity. That's just a measure of what we don't know about before the fact, what causes the economy to grow. The way we measure productivity growth is to say, well, we attribute part of growth to capital and part to labor, and what's left over is technology and productivity growth. In other words, what we don't know about. So we're counting on something we really don't understand. So, you know, I can give you my list. It's a consumption tax. It is spend more on not spend more on secondary education. Simply make sure that people graduate from high school being able to read and write, which they do not now. And I guess lastly, I would think make a serious effort to cut the budget deficit.
Thank you very much for joining us today.